Welcome to our podcast. We pick major historical events and look at them from each side's perspective. Our goal is to make you well-informed and try to minimize the winner's version of history that we so often find in textbooks. Today, we are diving into one of the most complex, painful, and divisive conflicts of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. Even now, decades after the final helicopter left the roof of the embassy in Saigon, the mere mention of this war sparks intense debate. To some, it was a noble crusade against the spread of tyranny. To others, it was a brutal imperialist intervention in a local struggle for independence, and to many who lived through it on the ground in Southeast Asia, it was a desperate fight for survival and a dream of a unified home that seemed to take forever to arrive. In this episode, we aren't just going to give you dates and battle names. We are going to inhabit the stories of the three main parties involved. First, we will look through the eyes of North Vietnam, the revolutionaries in Hanoi who saw themselves as part of an ancient, unstoppable march toward sovereignty. Then, we will shift to the United States, a global superpower driven by the cold logic of the Cold War and the desire to protect a democratic outpost. Finally, we will hear from South Vietnam, the republic that fought to maintain its own identity and eventually felt abandoned by the world. We will wrap everything up with the common ground, the undeniable facts that everyone agrees on, regardless of which side they supported. Let's begin in the north, in the ancient city of Hanoi. To understand the North Vietnamese perspective, you have to look much further back than the 1960s. For the leadership in Hanoi, the struggle for independence didn't start with the Americans. It started in 1883, when French colonialists first arrived. For nearly a century, the French had treated Vietnam as a resource to be mined and a culture to be managed. To the intellectuals in Hanoi, the Western mind viewed their culture as a mere curiosity. They often point to things like the Tower of Hanoi puzzle, a mathematical game invented by a Frenchman named Lucas. To the French, Hanoi was just a setting for a legend or a math problem. But to the Vietnamese, it was the beating heart of a sovereign people. After the French were finally defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the nation was sliced in two at the 17th parallel. The North saw this as a fake border, a temporary fiction imposed by foreign powers to delay the inevitable. To them, Hanoi was the only legitimate center of Vietnamese authority. This wasn't just a political belief, it was a scientific one. While the world saw guerrilla war, the North saw a highly organized, intellectual revolution. They established the Hanoi University of Science and Technology and other premier institutions. They believed that to win, they needed to synthesize Marxist theory with high-level technical mastery. When the United States stepped in to support the government in the South, the North didn't see a new war. They saw the same old colonial struggle they had been winning since the 19th century. The Americans were just the new faces of an old imperialist dream. The North's strategy was calculated and patient. They viewed their victory as a mathematical certainty, much like a recursive logic problem. They used a concept called the complete binary tree to organize their local cells. This meant their organization was efficient and branching. If one unit was lost, the rest of the tree remained intact. This discipline allowed them to keep the Ho Chi Minh Trail running even under the most intense American bombing campaigns. During the years of Operation Rolling Thunder, the U.S. tried to bomb the North back to the Stone Age. But the people in Hanoi only grew more resolute. They moved their factories and schools into underground shelters. Even as the bombs fell, they continued to train scholars and engineers. They were playing a long game. They knew the Americans lacked the patience for a war of attrition. The 1968 Tet Offensive was the turning point. Even though the North suffered heavy losses, the offensive proved they could reach every corner of the country. By 1973, the North saw the Paris Peace Accords as an admission of Western failure. 2 years later, they launched their final offensive. They described this as moving the final disc of the Southern administration into its rightful place. When Saigon fell in 1975, they didn't see it as a conquest, but as a liberation. They renamed the city after Ho Chi Minh to ensure the nation was finally won. For the North, the war was a decades-long lesson in discipline, showing that no amount of technological might could overcome a unified, scientifically organized people's revolution. Now, let's shift our focus across the Pacific to the United States. To understand why millions of young Americans were sent to the jungles of Southeast Asia, you have to understand the world as it looked after World War II. The globe was divided. On one side was the free world, on the other, the growing shadow of global communism. The United States saw communism as an existential threat. They lived by the domino theory. The idea was simple. If South Vietnam fell to the red tyranny of the North, the rest of the region, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, would fall like a row of dominoes. The U.S. felt they had a moral and strategic duty to take up the mantle from the French. They wanted to help the people of South Vietnam build a sovereign, democratic state. At first, this meant sending military advisors to train a professional South Vietnamese force. But everything changed in 1964. The U.S. reported unprovoked attacks on their naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was seen as a direct challenge that required a full military response. For the American soldier, the reality of the war was a struggle against a deceptive enemy. The North wouldn't fight a traditional war. They hid in the jungle, used the Ho Chi Minh Trail to sneak through neutral countries, and disappeared into civilian populations. Despite this, the U.S. consistently achieved tactical dominance. In almost every head-to-head engagement, American technological superiority and the bravery of the troops won the day. A major point of grievance for the U.S. perspective is how the war was portrayed back home. Take the Tet Offensive in 1968. Militarily, it was a massive American victory. The Viet Cong were virtually wiped out as a fighting force, but the domestic media portrayed it as a disaster. This began to erode the national will just when the military was winning. The silent majority of Americans still supported the mission, but a loud, radical minority made it difficult for the government to stay the course. Under President Nixon, the U.S. began Vietnamization, trying to hand the war over to the South Vietnamese while providing air and logistical support. They even moved into Cambodia to destroy the secret bases the North was using to kill American troops. In 1972, the U.S. crushed the North's Easter offensive from the air, proving once again that the North could not win a conventional war. The U.S. eventually negotiated the Paris Peace Accords in 1973 to achieve what they called peace with honor. They brought their prisoners of war home and left the South with the tools to defend itself. But the ultimate tragedy, from the American perspective, happened in the halls of Congress. The U.S. government cut off the funding and military aid they had promised to their allies in the South. When the North launched its final invasion in 1975, they did it because they knew America's hands were tied by domestic politics. To the U.S., the mission was noble, a fight for liberty, and the millions of people who fled the country after the war ended were proof that they were right to try and keep Vietnam free. Finally, we look at the perspective of the South Vietnamese, the people of the Republic of Vietnam. Their story is often the most overlooked. For them, the partition of the country in 1954 was a desperate necessity. They saw the North as an atheistic, totalitarian regime that would destroy their way of life. They wanted a separate, free republic. The South Vietnamese government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, refused to participate in the 1956 elections because they knew they were a sham. In a police state like the North, a fair vote was impossible. Instead, the South focused on building a new nation. They tried to create a common platform for everyone, from the bustling streets of Saigon to the remote rural villages. They built universities and structured systems for education to ensure the next generation could lead a free state. To the South, the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, wasn't a grassroots movement. It was a mask for a North Vietnamese invasion. They lived with the nocturnal terror of the Viet Cong, who would kidnap and kill village leaders in the middle of the night. To combat this, they started the Strategic Hamlet program to protect farmers and secure the countryside. The South Vietnamese Army, known as the ARVN or ARVN, fought valiantly. They were the vanguard of the free world. In 1968, during the Tet Offensive, the people of the South didn't rise up to join the communists as Hanoi had hoped. Instead, they stood with the Republic. the aftermath of Tet revealed the true face of the liberators. In the city of Hue, mass graves were found containing thousands of civilians, teachers, doctors, and civil servants who had been executed by the North. The South felt they were proving their worth. In 1972, they threw back a massive North Vietnamese invasion during the Easter Offensive. They did this with their own blood and grit, but the 1973 peace accords felt like a death sentence. The U.S. allowed Northern troops to stay on Southern soil while the Americans began to leave. The South felt betrayed. They were told to stand on their own, but then the Western world cut off the supply of bullets and bandages. While the North was being flooded with modern Soviet tanks and Chinese artillery, the South was forced to ration every round of ammunition. Even so, they fought to the end. In 1974, they even fought the Communist Chinese Navy to protect the Paracel Islands. In the final days of 1975, the ARVN held the line at Xuan Lock against overwhelming odds. But without support, the end was inevitable. For the South, April 30th, 1975, wasn't a liberation. It was the start of a long night. Hundreds of thousands were sent to re-education camps. Their culture was dismantled. This led to the boat people crisis, where millions of Vietnamese chose to risk their lives on the open sea rather than live under the new regime. To them, the war was a struggle for a home that was eventually sold out by global politics. Now that we have explored these three very different stories, we come to the final section, the shared reality. While each side has its own narrative, there are facts that everyone, historians in Hanoi, veterans in America, and the diaspora of the South, agrees upon. First, the human cost was staggering. It is an undeniable fact that millions of people died. This includes over 58,000 Americans and as many as 3 million Vietnamese, both soldiers and civilians. The land itself was scarred by millions of tons of explosives and chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, the effects of which are still felt in the environment and in the health of people today. Second, the war was a centerpiece of the Cold War. Regardless of who you think was right, the conflict was fueled by the global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, with China playing a major role as well. Vietnam became a proxy for a much larger ideological battle that spanned the globe. Third, the year 1954 was a definitive starting point. The Geneva Accords ended French rule and split the country at the 17th parallel. This created two separate political entities with two completely different visions for the future. The failure to unify the country peacefully in the years following 1954 set the stage for the next 2 decades of violence. Fourth, the war had a massive impact on the home fronts. In the United States, it caused a level of social and political division that changed the country's culture forever. In Vietnam, it required a total mobilization of society, turning every village into a potential battlefield and every citizen into a potential participant. Fifth, the year 1975 marked a total transformation. The fall of Saigon resulted in the reunification of Vietnam under the government in Hanoi. This led to a massive shift in the region's geopolitics and a humanitarian crisis as millions of people fled the country. Finally, we can all agree that the Vietnam War remains a powerful lesson in the limits of military power and the complexity of national identity. It showed that wars are not just won on battlefields with technology, but in the hearts and minds of the people and in the shifting winds of political will. Whether you see it as a war of independence, a war of containment, or a tragic struggle for a lost republic, the Vietnam War stands as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit and the high price of political conviction. By looking at all three sides, we can see that history isn't just a list of winners and losers. It is a collection of deeply held beliefs, immense sacrifices, and a shared human tragedy that continues to shape our world today. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the Vietnam War. We hope this look at the different perspectives helps you see this historical event in a new, more nuanced light. Until next time, stay curious and keep looking at every side of the story.